They say in Halifax, you never make eye contact with a man in a black car. But what if that man walks into your hospital ward carrying a boy who hasn't spoken in 7 months, and the boy reaches for your hand before his father can even say a word? Nora Fenn was just a pediatric nurse at Harbour Light Children's Hospital, running on 4 hours of sleep and a gas station coffee that tasted like regret. Between her brother's mounting physio bills at the rehab center on Barrington Street and the 3 months of back rent she owed her landlord, getting through a 12-hour shift without crying in the supply closet counted as a good day. She wasn't trying to be anyone's hero. She was just trying to stay afloat. It started on a Tuesday in October, the kind of cold that comes off the Atlantic and doesn't apologize for itself. Ward C, pediatric observation. Nora was refilling juice cups at the nurse's station when a black SUV pulled up outside the hospital entrance. Not into the patient drop-off loop, but directly onto the curb, the kind of parking that said the driver didn't particularly care about the rules. The man who stepped out didn't look like someone who had ever needed to. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal coat that cost more than Nora's monthly take-home. Dark hair, jaw like it had been cut from something expensive and cold. He had the kind of face that didn't arrange itself into expressions easily. Walking 2 paces behind him were 2 men in identical black jackets, scanning the parking lot with the flat-eyed efficiency of people trained to look for threats. Between the tall man and the hospital entrance, holding his hand loosely, not the way a child clings, but the careful, compliant grip of a kid who had learned not to make demands, was a boy. He was maybe 7 years old. He wore a good coat, clean boots, dark hair like his father's. But his eyes were the thing Nora noticed first, even from across the entrance vestibule. They were pale grey, and they were somewhere else entirely. Not frightened, not defiant, just absent, like someone had reached in and turned a dial all the way down. Nora went back to her juice cups. It wasn't her business. 40 minutes later, the boy was in Bay 4, and Nora was his assigned nurse. Dr. Anand had pulled her aside at the bay curtain and given her the 2-sentence briefing. Name Samuel, non-verbal for the past 7 months. Dad's flying in a specialist from Toronto, but the kid's running a fever and they wanted him monitored overnight. Father is. Dr. Anand paused in the way people pause when they're choosing their words carefully. Particular. The man, she'd read his name on the admission form, Lorne Ashby, and the name had snagged in her memory the way certain names do when you've heard them in a different context, was standing at the window when she pushed the curtain aside. He didn't turn around immediately. He was looking down at the parking lot with his hands clasped behind his back, and there was something in the posture, not arrogance exactly, but absolute containment that made the small bay feel even smaller. Samuel was sitting on the hospital bed. He had his coat folded neatly on his lap even though a nurse had offered to hang it up. He was looking at the wall across from him, and his right hand was tapping a slow, even rhythm against his knee. Not anxious, just present, just marking time. Nora walked to his bedside and crouched to eye level, the way she did with all her small patients, the move she'd stopped thinking of as deliberate and which had just become the way she moved through the world. "Hey, Samuel," she said. She didn't ask him how he was feeling. She'd learned early that questions were a kind of pressure, and pressure made silent kids go quieter. "My name's Nora. I've got the night shift, so you're stuck with me for a while." She held up the thermometer. "This one just goes under your arm. No needles." He didn't respond. He also didn't pull away. He allowed her to take his temperature with the careful stillness of a child who had learned to be cooperative. When she finished and made a small note on her tablet, she saw him watching her hand move. The way he watched it, intent, cataloguing, reminded her of her brother when he'd been learning to walk again after the accident. That particular quality of attention that comes from having to rebuild a relationship with a world that stopped making sense. She pulled a small package of animal crackers from her uniform pocket, the ones she kept for the kids who arrived without anything familiar. She set them on the bed rail without comment, not offering, just placing. She was halfway to the curtain when she heard the cellophane move. She didn't turn around, but she was smiling when she reached the nursing station. This was their routine for 4 days. Samuel's fever passed, but the specialist from Toronto was delayed, then delayed again. And the father, who Nora had begun to understand was not a man accustomed to waiting for anything, was somehow persuaded to keep Samuel at Harbour Light rather than airlifting the boy to a private facility in Montreal. She suspected Dr. Anand had managed this through a combination of medical reasoning and personal diplomacy. Each morning, Nora brought animal crackers and whatever small quiet thing she'd noticed Samuel respond to the day before. A sticker of a blue whale, a dog-eared paperback about trains, the specific kind of orange juice that came in the carton with the red straw. She never asked him to engage. She just showed up and did her job, and somewhere in the middle of doing her job, She started doing the other thing too. The thing that nobody puts in a job description. The thing that is just presence. On the third day, Samuel pressed a drawing into her palm when she was checking his chart. He did it in the same shielding way, arm curved around the paper to block his father's view across the room. That made her feel like it was something the boy needed to do privately, or not at all. She tucked it into her pocket. In the supply room 2 minutes later, she unfolded it. Crayon on the back of a hospital menu, a yellow stick figure wearing a nurse's uniform, and a smaller stick figure with grey scribble hair sitting in a bed. A red heart between them, slightly lopsided. Underneath, in the careful capital letters of a child who had learned to write but was being careful. Thank you. Nora stood in the supply room with a box of saline bags on one side and a rack of oxygen masks on the other, and felt something in her chest pull sideways. She looked back at the drawing, at the lopsided heart, at the yellow nurse with her yellow hair. "Who are you?" she whispered, and then, softer, "And what happened to you?" She found out on the 4th day. Not from the father, who had barely said 50 words to her across 4 days of monitoring, and not from the file, which had been flagged for privacy at a level that made the ward secretary nervous. She found out from Graham. Graham O.C. was a porter at Harbour Light, a big, cheerful man who had worked the hospital for 11 years and had an encyclopedic knowledge of Halifax's old money and its more recent arrivals. He was pushing a linen cart past the nursing station when he leaned in and said quietly, "You know who that is in Bay 4, eh?" "Lorne Ashby," Nora said. Graham raised his eyebrows. "Ashby Group, commercial, shipping and property, 3rd biggest private landlord in the Maritimes. Also," he dropped his voice further, "people say the family's been mixed up in long-haul freight that isn't exactly what's on the manifest. Not proven. But the name is the name." He moved on with his cart. Nora stayed very still at her station for a moment. Then she went back to Bay 4 to check Samuel's vitals, because that was her job, and also because she didn't really know what to do with the information, and the boy's pale grey eyes were easier to understand than anything she'd just heard. The trouble started on the 5th day. The man who'd been sitting in the family waiting room, big, in a tracksuit, scrolling his phone with the detached focus of someone who wasn't actually reading anything, had been there since Samuel was admitted. Nora had assumed he was a relative. He wasn't. He was something else. She didn't know what he was until she came into Bay 4 during her afternoon rounds and found Samuel not in his bed but wedged into the narrow space between the bedside table and the wall, knees to his chest, both arms wrapped around them. The tracksuit man was in the room. He wasn't touching the boy. He was just standing too close to the bed, talking on his phone, and his voice was low but sharp. Not a voice you'd use in a children's hospital ward unless you'd stopped caring that you were in a children's hospital ward. Doesn't matter what the old man wants. The timeline moves up or the arrangement changes. He registered Nora in the doorway and stopped talking. He looked at her the way men like him looked at nurses, like furniture that had briefly moved. Samuel hadn't moved. He was still in his corner, looking at the floor. Something in Nora's chest went the way it went when someone was unkind to an animal or a child, some current that ran past reason and decision and arrived at action before she'd made one. She walked in. "Visiting hours in observation bays are limited to immediate family," she said. Her voice was clear and ordinary and completely even, "and this ward is clinical quiet from 2 o'clock. She looked at the tracksuit man with the face she had learned from 3 years on pediatric nights. "I need you to take that call to the family lounge now, please." He looked at her for a long beat, the kind of look that was also a question, the question being, "Do you know what you're doing?" She looked back with the answer, which was, "I know exactly where the security phone is and I have dialed it before, and I will again." He left. Nora pulled the curtain across. She crossed to the corner where Samuel was. She sat down on the floor next to him, her back against the wall, not asking, not coaxing, just taking up the same square of floor at the same level until the current in the room shifted. After a few minutes, Samuel uncurled. He didn't say anything. He pressed his hand over hers briefly, the way a small person communicates something they don't have words for yet. When his father arrived 40 minutes later, Nora met him in the hall. She told him clearly, and without embellishment, what she had observed. Lorne Ashby listened with the kind of absolute stillness that is not calm. It is the thing before calm once. "He was in the room," he said. "It was not a question, yes." And Samuel was frightened. Something moved across Lorne Ashby's face, not anger, not exactly. More like the moment when a very controlled person allows themselves to know something they have been not knowing for a long time. He looked at her, really looked, not the way he'd looked at her across the bay for 5 days, distantly, like staff, but actually at her, and said, "Thank you, Miss Fenn." He turned and walked toward the elevator. His 2 men appeared from somewhere and fell in behind him without being called. Whatever happened next happened somewhere else, and Nora went back to her ward. 3 hours later, the man in the tracksuit was gone. He did not come back. That evening, after her shift, Nora came to say goodnight to Samuel, the way she always did. She found the boy cross-legged on the bed, and at the window, for once, his father was not looking at the parking lot. He was sitting in the bedside chair. He had Samuel's untouched train book open on his knee. He was reading aloud from it in a low, careful voice with the slightly unpracticed quality of a man who had not done this in a while. Samuel wasn't looking at him, but he wasn't somewhere else either. He was just there, in the room, listening. Nora didn't go in. She just stood at the curtain for a moment, and then she moved on, because that was not her moment to be in. The specialist from Toronto arrived on the 6th day, Doctor. Ewan came with a laptop full of assessments and a manner that was warm and methodical, and she took one session alone with Samuel that lasted 90 minutes and left the boy looking exhausted in the way that is also, somehow, lighter. She came out and spoke to Lorne Ashby in the family room for half an hour with the door closed. When he came out, Nora was at the end of the corridor writing her charts. He walked past, then he stopped, then he walked back. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the chair across from the nursing station. Nora nodded. He sat. He looked at the surface of the desk for a moment. Then he looked at her. Dr. Ewan has said Samuel's breakthrough, if it comes, will likely come from consistent trusted presence outside the clinical environment. Not therapy sessions alone. Someone he encounters in a neutral, regular way. Someone who has already. She showed me his drawings. He has drawn you 12 times in 6 days. Nora felt the sides of her world become very quiet. "My son doesn't do that," he said. Not with pride, with something more fragile. "Not anymore, Mr. Ashby. My household," he said, continuing as if he'd prepared this and was not going to stop now that he'd started, "is not what I would call uncomplicated. Samuel's mother died 8 months ago. A car accident on the 104. He was with her. He wasn't injured." He paused over that last sentence in the way people pause over facts that are technically true and entirely untrue at the same time. He hasn't spoken since. He has refused every nanny I've hired. Every therapist who comes to the house. He has not. He pressed his hand flat against the desk. He has not eaten a full meal in weeks without one of my staff having to coax him for 40 minutes. Until this hospital. Until your shift. Nora thought of the animal crackers. The careful way Samuel's hand moved when he opened the package. The cellophane sound she hadn't turned around for. "I want to make you an offer," Lorne Ashby said. "A position. Full-time companion for Samuel. Not medical. Not formal. Just what you are. Someone he comes to without flinching." His voice stayed even, but something in it tightened. "I pay well and I am thorough about my commitments. Your brother, Fin Fen, physiotherapy at Northwood Recovery, the accident last March. His outstanding balance is considerable. It would be cleared, immediately and completely." Nora went cold. "How do you know about my brother?" she said. It was not a question. "I know what I need to know," he said, not proudly, just plainly. "I have made it my business to understand who has been caring for my son." He met her eyes. "This is not surveillance in a sinister sense, Miss Fenn. This is a father who needed to know if the person his son trusted was trustworthy." She looked at him. He looked back. The thing about Lorne Ashby that she would only understand later was that he never tried to look harmless. It was oddly, perversely, more honest than people who did. "If I say no," she said, "you go back to your shift. Samuel goes to a facility in Toronto. We don't speak again." He said it without relish. "And your brother's bills remain as they are." She hated the neatness of it. She hated that it was also, in its own terrible way, transparent. She looked down at her hands. She thought of Samuel wedged in the corner of his bay, arms around his knees. She thought of the drawings, 12 of them, apparently, the ones she hadn't seen. She thought of her brother Finn on the phone last week, saying the rehab was making progress, but he was worried about March's bill, saying it in the careful tone he used so she wouldn't hear the fear underneath. She thought, "I am about to make a decision I do not fully understand, for a child I have known for 6 days, and I am going to do it anyway." "Fine," she said. "I'm in." His house was on the North Shore, past Bedford Basin, behind a stone wall that ran along the waterline for what seemed like half a kilometer. The gate was iron, flanked by cameras, and the 2 men at the post recognized the SUV and opened it without being called. The driveway curved through dark spruce trees and emerged into a grey evening light, in front of a house that was large and serious and faced the ocean with the composure of something that had been there a long time. Inside, Nora was greeted by a woman named Mrs. Petrovich, who ran the household staff with the energy of someone who had decided long ago that warmth and efficiency were not mutually exclusive, even if she was currently withholding the warmth while she assessed Nora with the polite neutrality of someone who had seen many people come through this door and was not yet certain what category to put her in. The tour was quick and functional. East Corridor was Samuel's domain. West corridor was Mr. Ashby's and inaccessible. The kitchen was shared. The back garden ran down to a private dock, and Nora was not to take Samuel outside the garden perimeter without clearing it with the head of security first. "Head of security," Nora said. "Mr. Tate-Brennick, you'll meet him tomorrow." Mrs. Petrovich glanced at her with the smallest recalibration. "He runs things carefully here." Nora's room was large, with a window that looked over the garden to the water. There were clothes in the wardrobe in her size. Practical things, soft things, nothing flashy. She stood in the middle of the room after Mrs. Petrovich left and thought, "Here I am then." She found Samuel in the smaller sitting room off the east corridor. He was at a round table, crayons out, working on something with the focused intensity of a person whose thoughts need to go somewhere. When she came in, he looked up. The grey eyes landed on her, and something in them shifted the way they'd shifted that first morning at Harbour Light. A dial turned a notch in the direction of present. "Hey," Nora said. She sat down across from him without fanfare. "I like your setup." She looked at the crayons, organized by color gradient, which she was fairly sure was not how they'd arrived in the box. "Mine were always a disaster. I could never find the right blue." Samuel looked at the crayons. He looked at her. Then, with the gravity of a 7-year-old conferring an honor, he slid the box toward her. They drew together for an hour, Nora making the absolute worst wail she'd ever attempted, while Samuel worked on something she wasn't supposed to see. When she left to sleep, she felt the shape of the house around her, quiet in the way that has weight and history in it, quiet that was about something. She lay awake listening to the ocean and thought about the tracksuit man, about the word Graham had used, manifest. On the third morning, she asked Mrs. Petrovich casually whether the same staff had been with the family long. Mrs. Petrovich gave her a look. "Some," she said, and moved on. That night, after Samuel was asleep and the house had settled, Nora went to the kitchen for water. It was 2 a.m. and the corridor was lit low, and she was half asleep herself, and that is the only explanation she ever gave herself for what happened next. She took a wrong door. It wasn't the kitchen pantry. It was a narrow room behind a door that had been left open a thumb width. She thought at first, but the far wall held a bank of monitors showing security feeds. 6 screens: the garden, the gate, the driveway, the east corridor, Samuel's room, and her room. She stood looking at the screen showing her empty bed for long enough that the cold of the stone floor came through her socks. Next to the monitors, pinned to the wall with a single tack, was a piece of paper. It was Samuel's drawing, not the Whalen nurse drawing, an older one. She could see it was older because the paper was slightly rippled at the edges, the way paper gets when small hands have handled it many times. It was black crayon, mostly, a car, a road, a figure lying in the road, and standing nearby a tall person in a long coat, their arm extended, palm out, the gesture of someone telling someone else to be quiet. Nora looked at the tall figure, the long coat. Samuel had been in the car with his mother. He had been in the wreckage. He had been, the file had said, retrieved from the scene by the household security team within minutes, by whoever had been closest. The tall figure in the drawing had something on its collar, a small square of yellow, like a pin, like a badge. A floorboard moved in the corridor. She turned. Lorne Ashby was in the doorway, no jacket, a dark sweater, bare hands, the look of a man who had also not been sleeping. His eyes went to the monitor showing her empty room, then to the drawing on the wall, then to her face. "I told you," he said. His voice was low and quiet in a way that was more serious than loud. "There are rules in this house." "I found the door open," she said. Her voice was steadier than she'd expected. "And I'm looking at a drawing your son made. The tall figure by the road." She pointed, not looking away from his face. "The badge on the collar. Who in your household wears a security badge?" Lorne Ashby's expression did something she hadn't seen it do before. It didn't harden. It went very still, and inside that stillness there was something sharp and directed like a compass needle swinging. "What color is the badge?" he said, not to her, more to the air. "Yellow." He stepped into the room. He didn't close the door behind him. He looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he turned and looked at her with an expression she would spend time later trying to name. It was not what she'd feared. It was not anger in her direction. It was something older than that. "My head of security," he said, "has been with this family for 9 years. He was the first responder at the accident. He was the one who brought Samuel out of that car." He paused. "He wears a yellow identification lanyard. All the household security staff do." He paused again. "He is the only one who was there before anyone else called." Nora felt the room rearrange itself. "You think he—" "I have no proof. I have been looking for 9 months." His voice was completely flat. Not because he felt nothing, but because he had said this sentence, in some form, many times in the dark. The accident investigation found a failure in Margot's brakes. The failure was ruled mechanical, but brake failures of that type don't occur spontaneously in cars that are maintained twice yearly. He looked at her. "The man who maintains the cars is a cousin of my head of security. He was dismissed 8 months ago for unrelated reasons. Or reasons that seemed unrelated. Have you told the police?" Something moved across his face, not evasion. Something more complicated. The police investigation was closed. Reopening it requires evidence. What I have are drawings from a 7-year-old who cannot speak, and a mechanical failure that the original investigator, who has since retired to a very comfortable house in Prince Edward Island, attributed to where. Then Samuel, Nora said, is the only witness. Yes, he looked at the drawing. And I cannot ask him to tell me what he saw. I cannot. His voice stopped. He took one breath. He is afraid of me, not of me directly. He is afraid of what is around me. He is afraid of this world, and I cannot get him out of it while I am still in it, and I cannot leave it until I know who destroyed what was most. He stopped again. He looked at her. You are the only person in this house who is new. The only one who wasn't here before, during or after. The only one he has chosen. He stood close now, close enough that she could see the exhaustion that lived behind his eyes and didn't leave even when the rest of his face was composed. He reached out and touched the edge of the drawing gently, not the figure but the road underneath it. He draws for you, he said. He shows you things he doesn't show me because he thinks I'll be angry, or he thinks. He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved. He thinks I blame him. He does not understand that I would burn down everything I have built before I let anything happen to him. Then tell him. Nora said quietly. He looked at her. He can't tell you what happened, she said, but he can understand what you tell him. He's 7 and he's listening to everything. He's been listening this whole time. She looked back at the drawing. He needs to hear it from you. Lorne Ashby stood very still. Then he nodded, once the way someone nods when they've been told something they already knew and needed someone else to say. The man who wears the yellow lanyard, he said. His name is Taid Brennick. You've been asked to meet him tomorrow. His eyes steadied on hers. I need you to be careful, and I need to know what Samuel shows you. I'll do what I can, Nora said. I know, he said, and he said it like he'd already decided that before she walked in. She did not sleep that night. The next 2 weeks moved in an odd double register. On the surface, Nora and Samuel falling into the easy companionship of people who communicate mostly without words. Painting. Building a completely inaccurate bird feeder from a kit she found in a garden shed. Walking down to the dock to look at the boats when the afternoon was clear. Samuel did not speak, but he had begun to do something that was close to speech. Humming a low, tuneless note when he was content, making a short, sharp sound when something was wrong, guiding her by the sleeve when he wanted her to look at something. She was looking. She was always looking. Taid Brennick was everything his job description suggested. Professional, alert, organized. He had a ready smile and an interest in logistics and a way of appearing in the same room as her, just often enough that she knew it wasn't coincidence. He wore a yellow lanyard with his photo ID clipped to it. His collar, when he wore the technical jacket, had a small loop where the lanyard threaded through. On the 4th day, she caught him watching Samuel with the careful attention of someone tracking something. On the 7th day, she found Samuel in his room after their walk, crouched by the window watching the driveway. She crouched next to him. She followed his gaze down to the circular drive, where Taid Brennick was talking to one of the gate guards. Samuel's hand was on her arm. He was gripping it with the careful, controlled pressure of someone frightened, but not surprised. She looked at his face. He looked at hers. He pointed, down toward Brennick. Then he pressed his hand over the place where a lanyard would hang on his own chest. Then he pointed at the driveway again. She covered his hand with hers. I know, she said quietly. I've got you. That evening she told Lorne Ashby everything. He listened without moving. When she finished, he said, There is a man coming tomorrow. From the RCMP. He owes me a conversation that has been delayed too long. He paused. I need Samuel not to be in the main house until the afternoon. I'll take him to the dock, she said. There will be staff there who I trust completely. Not Brennick's people. He looked at her, Nora. She noticed the name. She'd noticed the shift from Ms. Fenn over the past days, the way it had happened without announcement. Whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know. Samuel will not be affected by any of this. Whatever happens with the investigation, whatever happens with this house, his well-being doesn't change. That is already arranged, legally, separately. He paused. And your brother's care, that doesn't depend on you staying. I want to say that clearly. She looked at him. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Good, he said, and the word had weight in it. The next morning was the kind of clear autumn day Halifax occasionally produces, almost an apology for the months that bracket it. Nora took Samuel to the dock with a bag of crackers and the train book and a thermos of the hot chocolate that Mrs. Petrovich had started making without being asked. They sat on the dock with their feet over the edge, and watched a container ship move through the basin with the slow improbability of large things in motion. She was not thinking about what was happening in the house. She was watching Samuel watch the ship. He was tracking it with the same quality of attention he gave to crayons and trains and her hands when she was charting, intent, precise, taking it in. She didn't know what was happening in the main house. She found out much later, in pieces. The RCMP investigator, the logistical records Lorne Ashby had obtained through channels that the investigator had tactfully not asked him to specify. The communications between Tade Brennick and the cousin who maintained the cars. 9 months of patience paying down into a very cold hour in a study off the West Corridor. What she knew in real time was this. At 11:40 in the morning, Samuel turned to her. He had his crayon box with him. He opened it and he took out the yellow crayon and he placed it on the dock between them. He looked at it for a moment. Then, with the deliberateness of a child doing something he has been building toward, he picked it up and threw it into the water. It landed with a small, clean sound. They both watched it float. Samuel turned to her. He opened his mouth. "He's gone?" he said. His voice was very small and not used. It had the quality of something left in a drawer for a long time, slightly unfamiliar to its owner. Nora could not speak for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, he's gone." Samuel nodded. He looked at the water where the yellow crayon was drifting toward the boat channel. Then he leaned against her side, very simply, the way children lean against people when they're tired and trust where they've landed. She put her arm around him. She looked at the container ship moving out of the basin. She thought about her brother Finn answering the phone last night and laughing at something she'd said, the full laugh, not the careful one. She thought about Lorne Ashby saying her name. They stayed on the dock until the ship was gone. 6 months later, the bird feeder they'd built was held together with half a roll of outdoor tape and had accumulated a structural addition that Samuel had added unilaterally involving a piece of driftwood and a Canadian tire hook. It was attracting birds anyway, possibly out of obligation. Nora was in the kitchen when she heard footsteps on the back stairs, 2 sets, one heavy and one quick. The door opened and Samuel came in ahead of his father. Already talking, a continuous low-volume narration about the chickadee he'd seen, and its behavior relative to the gunko, which he considered inferior competition, and a proposed modification to the feeding station that would address this. "Good morning," Nora said. Samuel detoured past her to the counter and looked in the bread box with the entrepreneurial focus of a small person who had already decided what he wanted for breakfast. "Wren took the last of the raisin bread," he announced, referring to the house cat with the satisfied certainty of someone who has found his culprit. "We need to get more. We'll add it to the list," Nora said. Lorne Ashby came in. He was in weekend clothes, which he'd been wearing more of lately, as if the distinction between the man in the charcoal coat and the man in his own kitchen had gradually become less important to maintain. He poured coffee and stood beside Nora at the counter, and she was aware of the warmth of him, the comfortable proximity of it, in the way she'd been aware of it for some weeks now. Samuel, having provisioned himself with toast, came to stand between them in the way he'd started doing, this deliberate positioning that she was fairly sure was not accidental. He looked up at his father, then at Nora. He had a crayon in his shirt pocket, a red one. He took it out and set it on the counter between them, and then looked at them both with grey eyes that were, entirely, present. Lorne Ashby looked at the red crayon. Then he looked at Nora. Something moved across his face, warm and wry and careful, and he picked up the crayon and slid it into her hand. "For the record," he said quietly. "No," she said. She was smiling. "He's not." Samuel picked up his toast and went to look at the bird feeder from the window, humming the low, tuneless note that meant everything was fine. Outside, the ocean was doing what it always did, regardless of what happened on the shore. The morning light came in off the water and made the kitchen ordinary and bright and entirely, completely sufficient. Nora thought of a Thursday in October, a black SUV on the curb, a boy with grey eyes who'd looked at her from across a hospital bay like she might be someone worth looking at. She hadn't known what she was walking into. She did now, and she was right where she'd chosen to be.